Natalee Holloway finally getting the answers they say they've longed for 18 years after that Alabama teen went missing in Aruba.
Most people who grow up with a Western understanding of Christianity assume the Bible is a fixed, universal document. 66 books, the same Old and New Testaments, more or less identical from one church to the next. That assumption falls apart the moment you look at the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, whose biblical canon is the largest and arguably the most historically distinctive in the Christian world. It contains books that vanished from Western Bibles centuries ago, preserved in a tradition that traces its Christian roots back to the 4th century. This is a look at what's actually in that canon, where it came from, and why it matters, without the sensationalized claims that tend to circulate online about hidden or forbidden content. The real story doesn't need exaggeration to be interesting. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church recognizes a broader canon of 81 books, compared to the 66 found in most Protestant Bibles or the 73 in the Catholic canon, which also includes texts often referred to as the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical books. This isn't a matter of one church being more authentic than another, nor is it evidence of some hidden agenda on the part of any single tradition. It reflects centuries of distinct theological and historical development, largely shaped by Ethiopia's geographic and political isolation from the major centers of Christian doctrinal debate in Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria. To put the scale of the difference in perspective, the Ethiopian Old Testament alone includes more than 50 books, compared to the 39 found in most Protestant Old Testaments. The New Testament portion of the canon is closer in size to other traditions, though it includes a few additional texts depending on which list within the Ethiopian tradition is being followed. The Church itself recognizes a narrower and broader canon, with some texts considered authoritative for reading and worship and others considered useful but secondary. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia remarkably early, and this timing matters enormously for understanding why its canon developed so differently. According to church tradition, Christianity was established in the Kingdom of Aksum, a powerful trading empire in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, in the 4th century CE. Around the same time Christianity was being legalized and gradually adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine and his successors. The traditional account credits two shipwrecked Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Adesius, with introducing Christianity to the Aksumite court, with Frumentius eventually becoming the first bishop of Ethiopia after being consecrated by Athanasius of Alexandria, one of the most significant theological figures of the early church. This early connection to Alexandria is important. For centuries, the Ethiopian Church maintained its primary external religious relationship with the Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt, receiving its bishops from Alexandria well into the 20th century. This relationship placed Ethiopia within a particular theological lineage, one that, after the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, found itself increasingly separated from the churches that would eventually become Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. The Ethiopian Church, like the Coptic, Syriac, and Armenian churches, rejected the Chalcedonian formula regarding the nature of Christ and became part of what is now called Oriental Orthodoxy, a family of churches distinct from both Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Because Ethiopian Christianity developed along this separate theological branch, and because it was geographically remote from the councils, debates, and canon-defining decisions taking place in Western and Byzantine centers of power, it preserved religious texts and traditions that were debated, marginalized, or eventually excluded from canons elsewhere. The most famous of these preserved texts are the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, two works that were widely read and referenced by Jewish and early Christian communities in antiquity, but were ultimately left out of both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament as those canons solidified in other regions. The Book of Enoch is perhaps the most well-known of the texts unique to the Ethiopian canon, and it has a genuinely fascinating history that spans continents and millennia. It's attributed to Enoch, a figure mentioned only briefly in the Book of Genesis as the great-grandfather of Noah, described in just a handful of verses as someone who walked with God and was taken by God without experiencing a normal death. That sparse, mysterious reference apparently inspired an entire tradition of literature built around him in the centuries before and after the time of Jesus. What survives today as the Book of Enoch, more formally known as 1 Enoch to distinguish it from later, unrelated texts bearing his name, is actually a composite work, assembled from several originally separate sections that were likely written by different authors over a span of centuries, roughly between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century BCE. Scholars typically divide it into 5 major sections. The first and most widely discussed of these is the Book of the Watchers. It describes a group of rebellious angels known as the Watchers who descend to earth become enamored with human women and take them as wives, directly expanding on a cryptic passage in Genesis chapter 6 that mentions sons of God intermarrying with daughters of men and producing offspring described as giants or Nephilim. In Enoch's elaboration, these angels don't just intermarry. They actively corrupt humanity by teaching forbidden knowledge, including metalworking and weapon-making, the use of cosmetics and jewelry to enhance seduction, astrology, and various forms of sorcery and divination. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are portrayed as monstrous, violent beings whose destructive presence on earth becomes one of the central justifications for the flood narrative that follows in Genesis. The text names specific watchers, most prominently a figure called Semjaza, described as their leader, and Azazel, who is specifically blamed for teaching humans how to make weapons and ornaments. The second section, often called the Book of Parables or Similitudes, contains visionary material describing a heavenly figure referred to as the Son of Man, a messianic title that would later carry enormous significance in the New Testament Gospels, where Jesus repeatedly applies the title to himself. This section also describes scenes of final judgment, in which the wicked are condemned and the righteous are vindicated, along with descriptions of paradise and the fate of fallen angels. The third section is largely astronomical, detailing the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and laying out a 364-day solar calendar, a detail that connects directly to debates happening in certain Jewish communities of the period about how religious festivals should be calculated. The fourth section, often called the Book of Dream Visions, includes an allegorical retelling of biblical history using animals to represent different figures and nations, similar in style to apocalyptic literature found elsewhere in the ancient world. The fifth and final section, sometimes called the Epistle of Enoch, contains ethical exhortations and further apocalyptic predictions about coming judgment. Enoch was clearly influential among at least some Jewish communities around the time of Jesus. Fragments of the text, written in Aramaic, were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in the mid-20th century, demonstrating that it circulated and was studied by the community responsible for that collection, generally identified with or related to the Essenes. This discovery was significant because it confirmed that Enoch wasn't simply a late, marginal curiosity. It was a text taken seriously by a real religious community in the centuries immediately surrounding the life of Jesus. Its influence extended into early Christian literature as well. The New Testament Epistle of Jude, traditionally attributed to Jude the brother of James, directly references Enoch by name in verses 14 and 15, quoting a prophecy from the text about the Lord coming with thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment. This direct citation is part of why some early Christian communities and church fathers, including figures like Tertullian, treated Enoch as authoritative or at least valuable scripture in the first few centuries of Christianity. Some scholars have also pointed to thematic echoes of Enoch's angelic rebellion narrative in passages like 2 Peter, which references angels being cast into chains of darkness for sinning, and in general New Testament references to fallen angels and coming judgment. Despite this early influence, Enoch was gradually excluded from the canons that eventually became standardized in both Judaism and most branches of Christianity. The reasons for this exclusion were debated even among early church authorities. Figures like Augustine of Hippo argued against its canonical status, partly due to uncertainty about its true authorship, given that it claims to be written by a patriarch who lived long before the technology and concepts it describes. Many ancient readers as well as modern scholars considered it a later work written under Enoch's name, rather than an authentic record from the man himself. As Rabbinic Judaism solidified its own canon following the destruction of the Second Temple, texts like Enoch, which have been influential in the more diverse and apocalyptically minded Judaism of the Second Temple period, were left out of what became the standardized Hebrew Bible. For centuries afterward, the complete text of 1 Enoch was essentially lost to most of the world, surviving only in fragments and citations within other works, until it was discovered that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had preserved the entire text, translated into the ancient liturgical language of Guizi, as part of its official biblical canon. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is, in fact, the only major Christian body that has continuously preserved Enoch as canonical scripture, read and referenced as part of its tradition, rather than as a historical curiosity. The text was essentially unknown to Western scholars until the late 18th century, when a Scottish explorer named James Bruce, traveling through Ethiopia in search of the source of the Blue Nile, brought back several Guizi manuscripts of the book to Europe. These manuscripts eventually made their way into academic circulation, and the text was translated into English in the early 19th century by the scholar Richard Lawrence, sparking renewed scholarly interest in a work that had been largely inaccessible to the Western world for well over 1,000 years. The later discovery of Aramaic fragments of Qumran in the 20th century allowed scholars to compare the Ethiopic text against much older source material, generally confirming that the Guizi version, despite being a translation of a translation passed down across many centuries, preserved the substance of the ancient text with a fair degree of accuracy. Alongside Enoch, the Ethiopian canon includes the Book of Jubilees, sometimes referred to as the Little Genesis, because of how closely it follows and expands upon the narrative found in the biblical book of Genesis, along with the opening chapters of Exodus. Jubilees presents itself as a revelation given to Moses by an angel during his time on Mount Sinai, retelling the events of Genesis and early Exodus while organizing all of human history within a structured chronological system built around cycles of 49 years, referred to as Jubilees, themselves divided into 7-year periods called weeks of years. This obsessive attention to chronological and calendrical structure is one of the text's defining features, and it reflects a broader concern within certain segments of Second Temple Judaism about calculating sacred time correctly. A central theological argument running through Jubilees is its advocacy for a 364-day solar calendar, divided evenly into exactly 52 weeks, as opposed to the lunar-based or lunisolar calendar that became standard in mainstream Jewish practice. The author of Jubilees considered this solar calendar essential to properly observing religious festivals at their correct times, and the text repeatedly warns against the consequences of calendrical error, framing it as a serious spiritual failing rather than a minor technical disagreement. This calendar dispute connects Jubilees closely to other texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting it was particularly significant to the priestly and separatist communities associated with that collection. Beyond its calendrical concerns, Jubilees considerably expands on stories that receive only brief treatment in Genesis. It elaborates extensively on the lives of the patriarchs, adds significant detail to stories like the binding of Isaac and the experiences of Jacob, and introduces additional material about angels and demons interacting with the early history of humanity, including its own version of the Watcher's narrative connected to the flood story. The text places heavy emphasis on the patriarchs observing laws and festivals that, according to traditional Jewish chronology, wouldn't formally be given until the time of Moses, effectively projecting later religious law backward onto earlier biblical history to argue that these practices were eternal and always intended, rather than introduced for the first time at Sinai. Like Enoch, Jubilees was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in multiple manuscript copies, indicating it held real significance for the Qumran community and likely for other Jewish groups of the period as well. Also, like Enoch, it was eventually excluded from both the Jewish canon that solidified after the destruction of the Second Temple and from the canons adopted by the major branches of Christianity that developed in the Roman and Byzantine worlds. And once again, it survived in complete form primarily through the Ethiopian tradition, translated into Guizi and preserved as part of the broader biblical canon long after the original Hebrew text had effectively disappeared from circulation elsewhere, aside from the fragments later recovered at Qumran. The persistence of these texts in Ethiopia isn't really a mystery once the historical context is understood, and it doesn't require any explanation involving suppression, conspiracy, or hidden knowledge. As Christianity expanded and gradually centralized around major imperial centers, particularly following pivotal councils like Nicaea in 325 CE and Chalcedon in 451 CE, and the doctrinal consolidation that followed in their wake, decisions about which texts counted as authoritative scripture became increasingly standardized within the regions connected to those centers of ecclesiastical and political power. Ethiopia, however, occupied a fundamentally different position. It was geographically distant from Rome and Constantinople, connected primarily to the Coptic Church in Alexandria, and after the theological split following Chalcedon, increasingly separated from the broader currents of doctrinal development happening in the Byzantine and later Roman Catholic worlds. The Ethiopian Church developed its own canon largely on its own terms and its own timeline, shaped by local theological tradition, its own councils and religious authorities, and its enduring relationship with Coptic Christianity, rather than by decisions made thousands of miles away in cities the Ethiopian Church had little direct involvement with. It's also worth noting that Ethiopia's relative geographic isolation, while it limited certain kinds of theological exchange with Western and Byzantine Christianity, also offered a kind of protection. Texts and traditions that might have been actively phased out elsewhere through deliberate institutional decisions simply continued to be copied, read, and used in Ethiopian monasteries and churches, because there was no equivalent institutional pressure within that tradition to remove them. This wasn't a matter of Ethiopian authorities deliberately rebelling against or hiding texts that other churches had banned. These books were never universally declared heretical or dangerous across the Christian world. They were simply left out of canons that solidified in other regions through processes Ethiopia wasn't directly part of, while Ethiopian Christianity continued treating them as legitimate, valuable scripture, as it always had. In recent years, claims have circulated online, particularly across social media and certain corners of religious commentary, suggesting that the Ethiopian Bible contains some kind of hidden or suppressed revelation specifically about Jesus' resurrection, often framed as information that the Catholic Church, Western Christianity more broadly, or some unspecified religious authority supposedly worked to conceal from the public for centuries. These claims simply don't hold up against the actual documented content of the texts in question. Nothing in the Ethiopian canon offers a secret or alternative account of the resurrection that meaningfully contradicts the resurrection narratives found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are themselves part of the Ethiopian New Testament as well. The additional books that distinguish the Ethiopian canon from other Christian canons, Enoch, Jubilees, and several others such as 1 and 2 Maccabean, distinct from the Maccabees text found in Catholic Bibles, despite the similar name, primarily expand on Old Testament-era material, angelic rebellion narratives set before the flood, detailed calendar systems and patriarchal history, and apocalyptic visions concerned with cosmic judgment. They do not introduce alternative New Testament theology, nor do they offer a different version of events surrounding the crucifixion or resurrection. This kind of claim tends to follow a familiar and recognizable pattern common to a great deal of online religious misinformation. Take a genuinely obscure but real historical fact, in this case, the existence of a larger, less familiar biblical canon, and graft an exaggerated, dramatic claim onto it that the original fact doesn't actually support. The reality of the Ethiopian canon is interesting enough on its own terms without requiring this kind of embellishment. The genuinely compelling story here isn't a conspiracy about a suppressed truth concerning Jesus. It's a question of historical preservation and accident, which ancient texts survived, where they survived, and how an isolated and theologically distinct religious tradition can end up safeguarding pieces of a much older, broader body of religious literature that other branches of the same faith eventually let go of through entirely separate, well-documented historical processes. For scholars of early Judaism and Christianity, the Ethiopian canon is genuinely invaluable, and not because of any sensational hidden content. It's valuable precisely because it preserves material that offers a direct window into religious thought from a period when the boundaries of what counted as authoritative scripture were still actively being debated and were far less settled than most people today assume. Texts like Enoch and Jubilees demonstrate that the worldview of ancient Jewish communities, and by extension the earliest Christian communities that emerged from within Judaism, was in some ways far stranger, more cosmologically elaborate, and more concerned with angelic conflict and cosmic order than the streamlined, more theologically tidy canon most people encounter in a modern Bible. These texts also offer scholars crucial insight into the intellectual and religious environment Jesus and his earliest followers actually lived within. Concepts and titles that appear central to New Testament theology, including the title Son of Man, ideas about final judgment, the activity of angels and demons in human affairs, and apocalyptic expectations about the end of the present age, don't emerge in a vacuum within the Gospels. They reflect a broader religious conversation that had been ongoing for centuries within Second Temple Judaism, a conversation in which texts like Enoch and Jubilees were active and significant participants, even though they would later be excluded from the formal canon that most Jewish and Christian communities eventually settled on. The Ethiopian Bible, in the end, isn't a secret, and it isn't suppressed by anyone. It doesn't contain some shocking revision of the resurrection story, and there's no evidence that any religious authority ever worked to hide it from the world. Its existence has been documented in Western scholarship since at least the 18th century, and it has been openly practiced and studied within Ethiopia for well over 1,000 years before that. What it represents instead is something arguably more interesting than any conspiracy, a living religious tradition that, through a particular combination of early conversion, geographic distance, and theological independence, managed to hold onto pieces of a much older and richer literary and religious world. It's a world that the rest of Christianity, through its own separate historical processes of councils, debates, and canon formation, largely left behind, not erased, not hidden, simply set aside in one place while it continued to be read, copied, and revered in another.